Welcome back to another video, and today's video we're going to be talking about physique development and program design for personal trainers to implement with their coaches and have a bit of an understanding of like all the moving parts involved and decision-making processes involved in putting together a training plan for a client who is interested in improving their aesthetics and their physique and the way they look. Now, I think it's important to preface that the lens that we look through for physique development is very different to something like strength and performance and those kind of things. So there's going to be some things here that people are going to look at and maybe think that it contradicts their values and their knowledge and maybe their current stance on certain things. But we're looking at this solely from a physique development perspective. And when we talk about strength in other videos in the future or we have in the past, what we need to then consider if we've got a client who wants to be super strong and obviously have an aesthetic developed physique, got to kind of put the two together, just use common sense a little bit that, we're talking about different things here. Now, I think the first place that we go to, which is obviously the most common principle that's standalone when it comes to training, which is progressive overload. We're exposing our body to a stimulus to push the limits of, adaptation, making a shift in homeostasis to create adaptation. And then what we need to do is exceed the demands of that current stimulus on a weekly basis. Now, something as simple as lifting heavier, exposing our body to greater intensities through lifts is going to push our body to, create more strength, create more muscle, which obviously for physique development is what we would like to see. Now, we can also do that in terms of increasing reps. Some people like to, at some point, maybe increase the magnitude of the stimulus a little bit by driving a little bit more volume in terms of sets. But what we need to understand is that we have to push our system, not maximally, but near maximally, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the video, to, just shift the system or distort the system enough to want it to adapt and obviously meet the demands that we're currently exposing it to. Where if we do the same workout all the time and we're not really pushing ourselves, we essentially aren't creating an environment where our body needs to change because it can meet the current demands of what we're being exposed to. So we're not going to, from a development perspective, put on any more muscle. So your body doesn't deem it necessary. It's not going to put energy costly and metabolically costly tissue on itself, so it has to work harder if it doesn't need to. We've got to really encourage it to do so, and we have to make sure that our programs have some form of progressive nature in terms of volume, intensity, generally frequency or time in some instances, so that we can drive those adaptations that we want. Okay, so now we're going to talk about loads, percentage of 1RM loading and rep ranges, because it's important to, understand like where we can use, heavy loadings, where we can use lighter loadings, how they kind of fall into the decision-making process of program design for a client. Now, when it comes to hypertrophy, we can achieve, muscle growth from rep ranges of about 5 to 30 reps, which is supported by data and research at the moment. So we can achieve hypertrophy through a wide variety of rep ranges, and it's advantageous to take your clients through a wide variety of rep ranges, because when we look at, like muscle fiber distribution, we've got fast twitch fibers, which are more responsive to moderate to heavy loads. We've got slow twitch fibers, which are more responsive to moderate and lighter loads. And then we've actually got hybrid ones, which are a combination of fast and slow twitch, which are kind of responsive to both to a degree, but will sway towards whatever you expose your muscles to, or whatever you expose your client's muscles to, over a repetitive period of time, which is going to take a long time. It's not an acute responsive period. But it's important to understand that. So if we want to maximize the gains that we've got to expose our body to heavy loadings and lighter loadings as well. When it comes to rep range considerations, which obviously are going to reflect the loadings, because we're going to be working relative to someone's maximum for that rep range in terms of percentage of 1RM, heavy loading basically stimulates muscle fibers almost sufficiently from rep 1. Like when we talk about like a 5 RM, like the first rep is going to be challenging. There's going to be slow muscle fiber shortening speeds. There's going to be a large amount of motor recruitment. There's going to be a lot of tension on the muscle, which is a major driver of muscle growth. But there's not going to be a large amount of like peripheral fatigue or something. But there doesn't need to be, because the load is that high that we've got a large amount of recruitment through muscle fibers. And then we've got this slow shortening speed because the load is that heavy that requires a slow controlled movement. That we've got a large amount of kind of intramuscular force being happening here, because actin and myosin can touch and make contact and forcibly grip and pull and shorten that muscle and shorten those sarcomeres to make sure that happens. Now, because of that, we don't necessarily have to train to failure. We're getting a lot of bang for buck for our effort here. It's just that heavy loadings have a degree of risk. because we need to make sure that we've got good rep precision and good skill from the client to perform that exercise on a continuous basis safely. Now, when it comes to, I guess, like more moderate to light loads, like I've got like 6 to 30 here, but I think a moderate load's probably more, 10 to 20, maybe even 8 to 20 plus. Basically, what needs to happen here is there needs to be a level of peripheral fatigue being achieved within the muscle. So it's the fatigue in the muscle from multiple different metabolites that changes the internal environment of that muscle, which actually will affect the muscle's ability to contract. And what happens then is your brain will start to recruit more motor units and get involved more muscle fibers so that it can continue to complete the exercise at hand. Now, as that happens, we will start to achieve slower muscle fiber shortening speeds. So we'll start to get this greater amount of intramuscular force because the actin and myosin filaments can make contact and those sarcomeres can shorten and spend more time together in that shortened position. And that's going to increase the stimulus to drive those adaptations. Think about when you do a lighter set, like say like 10 reps, like the first, say 3 to 5 reps are quite easy. Like they're not really that challenging. It's really the second half of the set that starts to become quite stimulating and quite challenging. That's the concept that we want to have here. Now we understand that when we look at heavy loadings and the benefits of those and lighter loadings, thinking, all right, well, we've got to kind of train a little bit more and do a little bit more reps to get this kind of slower shortening speed and this larger muscle fiber recruitment, it might be advantageous just to do more heavier reps. Now, it's not necessarily the case because there's exercises out there where we can't really do heavy loadings, like whether it's from a skill perspective, whether it's from a leverage perspective. We've got to think about, okay, well, what's the safest way to execute this movement? What are the capabilities of the client? What do they have access to? And how can I make the program fit to drive the greatest, I guess, stimulus for muscular development to make sure that we're adhering to the goals of the client? So when it comes to understanding the definition of proximity to failure, it's how close to the muscle's inability to perform to complete the task that person gets. So if someone had a proximity to failure of 0, that means they've reached the point where their muscle is that fatigued, there's so much peripheral fatigue in the muscle that they can no longer perform the movement to the predetermined range of motion, give themselves, I guess, like a tick of approval when it comes to what's an acceptable rep, because that muscle can no longer complete that task. Now, when it comes to effective muscle fiber stimulation, how close a muscle is trained to failure is quite indicative of how much motor unit recruitment and muscle fiber stimulation it will get. When we have a brief discussion before about loadings and how loadings can recruit more muscle or less, and we have to maybe train shorter or longer, that's going to influence kind of how close to failure we need to go. So when we look at something like a heavy loading set, let's say the 3 to 5 reps that we were talking about before, we don't necessarily need to train to failure because we're going to get a large amount of stimulation, a sufficient stimulus because there's slow shortening speeds, there's lots of intramuscular force, there's lots of tension on the muscle, those kind of things. So we can kind of train within, say, 0 to 3 reps of failure to achieve the stimulus and make sure we do it safely. Now, some people are going to want to gravitate more toward closer to failure and train closer to failure because they might have the skill, they might be more trained, they might see the benefits of that. That's fine. We don't necessarily need to train to complete failure where, like if we're on a back squat, for example, that we're burying ourselves, on the safety bars and stuff to kind of achieve the goals that we want. So like the load's heavy enough to stimulate the fibers to create the adaptation. When it's heavy, they're the advantages that we have. As the loadings get lighter and the rep ranges get higher, we obviously need to train closer to failure to achieve the same amount of motor unit recruitment and muscle fiber stimulation, because if we don't create a degree of peripheral fatigue, we're not going to get this signal from the brain to start to recruit other motor units that start to fire other muscle fibers to help your current muscles involved in the movement complete the task when fatigue starts to surmount. So when it comes to a 6 to 10, 8 to 12 kind of rep range, we would need to train closer to failure, like something like 2 reps to failure. Within 2 reps of failure is a really good place to kind of use as a gauge. And that's because we need some peripheral fatigue to kind of get some more motor units involved to make sure that we get the adequate amount of stimulus. Now, as we get beyond, say, 15 reps, even beyond, say, 12, for example, we actually need to train probably to complete failure because the weight is so light that it's going to take longer for fatigue to surmount and to get this motor unit recruitment in sufficiently to recruit all of these muscle fibers. Now, especially when the weight is really light, It's only when the muscle is fatigued the most peripherally that we will start to get the fast twitch high threshold motor units in right at the end, as they're going to be the last resort for our brain to get involved to complete the task. Now, when it comes to prescribing rep ranges for clients, in my opinion, most trained individuals for physique development should train between, say, 5 and 6 reps and 15 reps. Every single rep that they perform should be majorly in that rep range, because you can expose your muscles to a sufficient degree of tension from an intensity perspective at 5 to 8 RM, for example, and then you can train sufficiently up to 15 reps and get a similar adaptation that if you trained beyond that as well. Because if we look at from 15 reps onwards to upwards to 30, which is the research shows we can grow, we've just got to think about like what's involved in the set failing there. We've got boredom, cardiovascular fitness, maybe some skill. Those things are going to start to influence the failure point. I know for myself personally, if I start to rep beyond 15 for most exercises, I just get bored. And I'm just like, all right, this set's over. I'm going to tell my brain that it's over. My brain thinks that failure's happened, and it hasn't. And I haven't quite achieved the stimulus that I wanted to from the training. I haven't maximized my potential. Now, that's not a set in stone for everybody. Obviously, there's times where, more reps is going to be advantageous. Maybe your goals permit it. Maybe you've got physique development, a little bit of, say, metabolic work in there, and you're going to do that because you want to change the energy systems and burn some more calories and those kind of things. But just have a think about when we talk about actual failure and when we're talking about the muscle's inability to complete an exercise, that we are actually putting ourselves and our clients in an environment where they can achieve that more regularly and more consistently. It's going to take a little bit for them to learn the scale, and you guys have to coach them what it means. And if you're a face-to-face coach, and even if you're not, put them in an environment where they can do it safely. A leg extension, push-ups, a seated row, something where they can bury themselves on it and do it safely, so they feel it. They know, they understand what it feels like for their muscles to not actually work anymore. And then you can tell them like, so this is what 2 reps from failure is. This is what actual failure is. And they can start to work on understanding the skill and the spectrum of rep and reserve. So we're going to wrap this up. In part 2 of this video, we're going to be talking about volume, frequency, rest intervals, exercise selection and order, and tempo. Hopefully you guys got a bit of an understanding, even just now, about how the working parts involved in putting a program together for a physique orientated client. Okay guys, I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to hit the link in the description, make your way to the website, take advantage of the free resources and all of the articles and other media that we have there for you guys to increase your skill set and develop your business. See you in the next video.